Okay, so we'll talk about hyponatremia today. It's a very interesting and an important topic. The thing with hyponatremia, it is so common that almost 22% of the hospitalized patients are found to have hyponatremia when they are admitted to any general hospital. And all those practicing in the medicine wards or otherwise will realize this is so true. I think 22% is also an underestimation because I myself see almost 1 out of 2 people who we admit have mild or moderate or severe hyponatremia. So this is a very important topic and often not understood well. So the first statement is absolute sodium concentration tells nothing about the volume of the patient. So please do not believe that if the sodium is 118, for example, you need to rush in fluids. That is not necessary because the first instinct by all people is to rush in sodium chloride, and they just assume that the patient is dehydrated, which is not the case. As the lecture progresses, we'll realize that there are so many conditions in which there is hypervolemia, and you actually need to stop fluids to increase sodium. Okay, and also please do not ignore chronic hyponatremia. There are patients who come to you who say their sodium is chronically low, around 125, 126, and you tell them if it's not causing any problem, you don't have any symptoms, you can do nothing about it. But that's not true because chronic hyponatremia itself shows subtle changes in concentration ability, in memory, and especially in the elderly, it increases the risk of fall. So please do not take it lightly, and please treat hyponatremia even if it's chronic and even if it is mild. Okay, sodium regulation is closely linked to fluid regulation in the body, and it's all very relative many times, and it's regulated mainly by water intake and vasopressin. The main receptor that controls the sodium balance and water balance in the body is located in the anterior hypothalamus, and their baroreceptor and osmoreceptor regulation controls it. Let's not get into physiology too much because we need to learn how to manage a case. Okay, vasopressin, as we all know, is released by the posterior pituitary. It comes from the hypothalamus and it acts on V2 receptors by inserting aquaporin 2 in the apical membrane of the principal cells of the collecting duct. So it's at the end of the nephron that the exchange of water or the major absorption of water takes place. Okay, and the increased secretion of vasopressin can be stimulated because of increased osmolality, decreased ECF volume. These are the various causes. And obviously decreased osmolality, that means increased dilution, causes decreased vasopressin release. So vasopressin is anti-diuretic hormone. So it sucks in water from the collecting duct. Right. Hyponatremia now can be categorized into 3 main categories, right? And the most important and the truest form of hyponatremia is a hypotonic or a true hyponatremia. So if you measure serum osmolality of a patient, and if the osmolality is low and the sodium is low, only then it is considered as a true hyponatremia. If the patient has a high osmolality, serum osmolality, or a normal serum osmolality, it is not a true hyponatremia. So for someone to call someone having true hyponatremia, there has to be true decrease in serum osmolality. Okay. Pseudohyponatremia or isotonic hyponatremia is actually a lab artifact. Okay. In cases of people having high lipid or protein concentration in the serum, the dilutions that happen in the equipments in the laboratories misjudge the sodium. So the workaround to that is to use a sample which is undiluted. But most of the machines that do biochemistry in the lab use diluted samples. So in such cases, if you have a very reliable blood gas analysis machine or an ABG machine, you can check the sodium values in that. And in such cases, thus, because ABG machines always take an undiluted sample and don't take a diluted sample. So that is when you have a very high lipid concentration in the brain, in the serum, for example, in patients with very high LDL and triglyceride levels, the proper sodium value that comes from the lab might not actually be true. So that is a pseudo hyponatremia. Now there's something called translocation hyponatremia. As mentioned in this thing, the hypertonic hyponatremia, which is a translocation hyponatremia, when there is increased osmolality in the blood, but you find that the sodium is low. So ideally, in all cases of hyponatremia, you must check the serum osmolality first. Okay. Ideal is to always have a measured serum osmolality, but that is not possible in all settings because of resource limitations. So you need to at least calculate by formula. So translocational hyponatremia is hypertonic hyponatremia, and it happens when there are other additional osmoles present in the serum that cause increase in osmolality, and thus there is a relative decrease in sodium. So if there is a lot of glucose, mannitol, glycine in the blood, this may cause hyponatremia, but it is not a true hyponatremia. It is actually a osmolar hyponatremia. And remember, this is different from pseudo hyponatremia because, as I told you, pseudo hyponatremia is a lab artifact, but this is actually a hyponatremia because of other osmoles present in the serum. Okay. Now there is a concept of effective osmoles and osmoles. Now the thing is that although you remember this calculation of serum osmolarity uses sodium, potassium, urea and glucose, but urea is not an effective osmole. If something has to be an effective osmole, it has to keep away from, it has to compartmentalize itself into one compartment across a membrane. If something is freely permeable through a membrane, it cannot be an effective osmole, correct? So if there is a membrane, if sodium is more on one side and it is less on the other side, and there are channels required to move sodium from one to the other side, only then it can pull in water, correct? But something like urea, it passes freely between membranes. So generally it should not be considered an effective osmole, because if it is passing freely between membranes, it cannot cause water shift. Hence, it is not an effective osmole. So when you are looking at hyponatremia, just keep this in the back of your mind that serum osmolality itself, having urea in it, is not a very good thing, because that does not cause changes in water. It is good for calculation purposes, but it does not cause water shifts. So actual effective osmolality, serum osmolality, minus the effect of urea, which is blood urea nitrogen divided by 0.28. If you take this formula and you add BUN, that is blood urea nitrogen, by 2.8, it becomes serum osmolality. Okay, so serum osmolality minus BUN by 2.8 becomes effective osmolality, because urea is not an effective osmole. Now, as I told you, hyponatremia, this is true hyponatremia now that I'm talking about, which is decreased serum osmolality or effective osmolality. If that is present, only then you call it a true hyponatremia. And that can present to you in various forms. The first thing, especially if you are not in a setting in which you have a very good lab at your disposal, you need to assess the volume status of the patient. And it can happen in 3 different states: decreased ECF volume, normal ECF volume, and increased ECF volume. This is very important because you have to understand the pathophysiology behind it. Okay, let's look at examples of various causes that can cause these 3 kinds of pictures. Decreased ECF volume. Now there is a sodium loss going on. Okay, and the sodium loss can be through GIT. If it's vomiting, what happens is you lose hydrochloric acid, chloride. Okay, and you start losing sodium because there is you lose acid, so there is metabolic alkalosis. Okay, so you start losing sodium with bicarbonate. That's why you should use chloride as a better indicator. In case of diarrhea, the kidneys need to preserve sodium. Okay, because bicarbonate is lost and kidneys need to preserve sodium, and thus there is low chloride in urine. In cases of transdermal loss, most common and very rare though is cystic fibrosis. Sodium can also be lost through kidneys, which is the most common cause, and never forget this cause, thiazide diuretics. Okay, you will get elderly patients with hyponatremia and you check their prescription, most commonly they would be taking some chlorothiazide, hydrochlorothiazide or some other drug, right? Now, thiazide diuretics are the biggest culprits in causing hyponatremia caused by diuretics. Why is it that loop diuretics do not cause? They do cause, but not so much. That is because loop diuretics act at the loop of Henle, correct? And thiazide diuretics act at DCT. And the loop of Henle mostly lies in the renal medulla and the DCT lies in the cortex. Now, for urine to be concentrated very well and to pull in water from the urine into the interstitium, the medulla needs to be concentrated well. Okay, so when there is a collecting duct going, this is a collecting duct, and as I told you, aquaporins pull in water from the collecting duct into the medulla. If the medulla is very well concentrated, they pull in a lot of water. So there is a lot of dilution into the interstitium and thus into the blood. What loop diuretics do is they act on the channel in the loop of Henle, right? So they stop solutes from entering from the loop of Henle into the interstitium. Thus, they do not cause very much medullary concentration. So they do not affect the medullary concentration. They do not increase the medullary concentration a lot. That is why they do not pull in a lot of water from the collecting duct. So they cause a lot of free water loss in the collecting duct and hence into the urine. However, thiazides, because they act in the renal cortex, the renal medullary concentration is still very high, and that causes a lot of fluid retention also, but more of salt loss as compared to water loss, right? I know this is a difficult concept, but go back and read about it. Loop diuretics do not increase the renal medullary concentration a lot. Hence, they do not cause a lot of salt loss as compared to water loss. They cause more water loss. Hence, loop diuretics do not cause a lot of hyponatremia. The most common and the most important culprit is thiazide diuretics. Primary adrenal insufficiency, cerebral salt wasting, salt losing nephropathies can also cause renal sodium loss. And the other possibility is third spacing. Now, many times third spacing happens with increased ECF volume also, but decreased ECF volume can happen, and there is when there is a reduced effective circulatory volume, muscle trauma, bowel obstruction, and other such causes. Okay, the most important and the most discussed point in hyponatremia, true hyponatremia, is SIAD, and this is a condition in which there is normal ECF volume. The most important is serum of inappropriate antidiuresis. Now, it used to be called SIADH, which means syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone, but that is not the only cause, because even the receptors can have defects. So it's wrong to call it SIADH. So the appropriate term to use is syndrome of inappropriate antidiuresis. Do not use the word hormone, because the hormone is not always at fault. Sometimes the receptors are also at fault. Okay, normal ECF volume can happen in secondary adrenal insufficiency also. Okay, and high water and solute intake, like too much of beer. Normal ECF volume also occurs in patients with primary polydipsia, exercise-induced hyponatremia, and moderate to severe hypothyroidism, although this is very rare. I told you why it is not SIADH, and why is there euvolumia. Basically, after a point, what happens is the receptors get saturated and then the absorption becomes less. That's why the amount of fluid being reabsorbed decreases, and at one point it gets saturated. So initially there is an increased antidiuretic hormone secretion in SIADH, correct? Because it's the syndrome of inappropriate antidiuretic hormone secretion. At one point, all the receptors that are used get saturated, and after that point it reaches a plateau, and thus the volume increase does not happen after that, and it stops at euvolumia or just mild hypervolume. So progressive hyponatremia until the V2 receptors and aquaporin 2 expression is downregulated because of saturation. Now, SIADH can be caused by many factors. Lung cancers are very peculiar in this aspect and very notorious for causing it. But other cancers can also do it. Any pulmonary pathology for that matter, TB, pneumonia can cause it, and any CNS pathology, especially meningitis, infections, masses, cerebral venous thrombosis, GBS, acute intermittent porphyria, delirium tremens can cause SIADH. Also, don't forget that SIADH can be caused by drugs, and the most commonly prescribed drugs that we regularly see in our prescriptions, PPIs, carbamazepine, and antipsychotics. Please do not forget that if a patient comes to you with euvolumic hyponatremia, you assess him, you find that the volume status is normal, and I'll mention the criteria later in the slides. You find that the patient has SIADH, please look at the drugs that the patient is taking. NSAIDs, PPIs, antipsychotics, carbamazepine, very important drugs to look at when you find hyponatremia which is of the SIAD kind. And there are other causes which are not very common. Okay, now SIAD criteria, these are just to help you. I mean, there is no hard and fast rule. First thing is that the effective serum osmolality is less than 275. That means it's a true hyponatremia. First, you have to prove it's a true hyponatremia. A pseudo hyponatremia or a translocational hyponatremia or a hypertonic hyponatremia is not SIAD. Then what happens is urine osmolality is more than 100. Clinically, euvolumia, urine sodium is more than 30. Obviously, you have to rule out adrenal, thyroid, and pituitary and renal insufficiency diseases to classify someone as SIAD, because all these can also cause a similar kind of hyponatremia. And no recent use of diuretics. This can confuse the picture because diuretics, as you know, also lead to loss of sodium in the urine. So if you find high sodium in the urine, the first thing you look at is diuretics. If you don't find diuretics and the patient has euvolumia, then you think about SIAD. There are other criteria to help you diagnose SIAD, but by no means they are rigid. Uric acid less than 4, urea less than 21.6. This is very important. Now, as we go towards management, you'll realize that this is kind of a therapeutic as well as a diagnostic approach. You give someone 0.9% saline. If that patient improves, that means there was hypovolumia. If that patient does not improve, that means the patient has either euvolumia or hypervolumia, right? So in this case also SIAD is a euvolumic condition, so it will not improve with 0.9% saline. It is corrected through fluid restriction, and the fractional excretion of sodium is more than 0.5%. There are various patterns of SIAD. Unregulated release is the most common. That is what is called SIADH. But as I told you that there are other forms of SIAD which can happen not due to hormonal release but other problems, and that is why it is now called SIAD. The other patterns are osmostat gets reset, for example, in pregnancy. Okay, then there are persistent normal levels of ADH, but it gets leaked. Receptor defects can happen, and altered baroreceptor response can also cause hyponatremia. Let's go on to the third category of hyponatremia, which is increased ECF volume. So we've studied hypovolumic, for example, renal loss of sodium or GI loss of sodium. And we've studied normovolumic, the most common being SIAD, but secondary adrenal insufficiency can also cause. And the third most common is increased ECF volume. And remember, increased ECF volume from our MBBS days, whenever we get a patient who is swollen, who has pedal edema, who has pleural effusion, we look at the kidney, liver, and heart. Okay, and these are the three most common causes of an increased ECF volume. So there is a dilutional hyponatremia in this case, because the fluid in the body is so much that even the normal concentration of sodium is low. Also, it stimulates the RAAS system, and that leads to more fluid retention, because there is ineffective circulatory volume that reaches the kidney that triggers the renin angiotensin system, and that causes more fluid retention as compared to retention of solutes. So you can have a kidney disease, heart failure patient or a liver failure patient, and you might find hyponatremia in them. Please assess the volume status properly, because you giving NaCl 0.9% to them will only worsen things. Now you can classify hyponatremia, their definition based on either biochemical parameters, duration or severity of symptoms. The most important part in management of hyponatremia is severity of symptoms. The biochemical values and the duration of symptoms really doesn't matter in management of hyponatremia. Biochemically, mild, moderate and profound. They used to use the word severe, but they've now cancelled that word, because severe hyponatremia is now used only for severe symptomatic hyponatremia. So biochemically mild, moderate, profound are the words used for biochemical classification of hyponatremia. The duration classification is acute and chronic. By default, if you find a patient with hyponatremia, think of it as chronic, because it only takes 48 hours for the brain to adjust to new sodium values. So that is why acute and chronic cutoff is 48 hours, because it takes 48 hours for the brain to adjust to those new values. And acute hyponatremia, although rare, can be caused especially exercise induced. You'll find patients who've run a marathon and suddenly they'll have hyponatremia, they'll fall down, they'll have unconsciousness. In such cases, it is a acute hyponatremia. It can also be multifactorial if someone is taking thiazides as well as drinking a lot of water. So a runner who's drinking water on a marathon and he's on diuretics, especially thiazides, he's very likely to develop acute hyponatremia. An important cause is colonoscopic preparations. You order that commonly for colonoscopies. Please be careful, it can cause acute hyponatremia. Now, based on symptoms, because they don't want you to treat any hyponatremia lightly, they've considered only two categories. This is from the European guidelines. They consider only two categories based on symptoms: moderately severe, which has nausea, confusion and headache, and severe, which has persistent vomiting, cardiorespiratory distress. The most important of these being GCS less than 8 and seizures. So, and if you have a very drowsy patient has seizures, multiple episodes of vomiting or chronic cardiorespiratory distress, that patient has severe hyponatremia and must be treated aggressively. Mild symptoms, these are from Indian guidelines. They say that mild symptoms happen in chronic hyponatremia and fatigue, dizziness, gait disturbance. As I mentioned before, a subtle loss of concentration can be the first sign of a chronic hyponatremia. Okay, how to approach such a patient? Most important is history and examination. I'm mentioning again drug history, diuretics. Not only are diuretics important in cases of SIADH, they can also cause volume decrease. And SIADH also look at drugs. Your inquiry of the patient's drug history does not stop at diuretics, because as I mentioned the list of drugs, there are so many important and common drugs that can cause SIAD. Okay, ask for history of diarrhea, vomiting, try determining the volume status and try determining the BP in lying and standing position, because this will give you an idea about the volume status. So if your patient's BP is falling down more on standing up, it can give you the volume status. Also in adrenal insufficiencies, it can happen. And examination to look for lung and CNS lesions, because they are the most common causes of SIAD. Now, this is a stepwise approach. I will send the PowerPoint presentation to you. You can go through this, but this is by no means exhaustive and it's not rigid. You don't have to follow it. Okay. You measure serum sodium and serum osmolarity. Serum osmolarity is just to confirm that it is true hyponatremia. And I will go to the algorithm which shows how serum urine osmolarity and urine sodium are important. These ones are not very important. Uric acid does help you because it is low in cases of SIAD. Okay. Also, if you do an ABG, it might help you. For example, if you find metabolic alkalosis and hypokalemia, you will think of diuretic use or vomiting. If you have acidosis and hypokalemia, you will think of diarrhea being the cause. So other things might help you. In SIADA, you will have a normal acid-base balance and potassium. So that really helps. Okay. Now this is the algorithm from the European guidelines. So the first step it says is you find hyponatremia, exclude hyperglycemia and other causes of non-hypotonic. So that means either hypertonic or translocational, that is hypertonic, or a pseudo-hyponatremia. Once you rule that out, you have hypotonic hyponatremia, which is also called a true hyponatremia because that has true decrease in serum osmolarity, right? And then you look at if the patient has acute or severe symptoms. If it is acute, so happening within less than 48 hours, which is very rare, for example, in a marathon runner, and the patient has symptoms, you treat immediately with hypertonic saline. And what rates and how to give, I will come to that later. But any acute hyponatremia and any hyponatremia with severe symptoms. So if the patient's GCS is low, please do not consider that the patient has chronic hyponatremia and you have time to correct. It is important to understand that the risk of swelling in the CNS cells or the risk of brain edema in such a case is much more than the risk of osmotic demyelination syndrome. So if the patient has very severe symptoms, please give hypertonic saline fast. I will tell you how much to give, but do not shy away from giving hypertonic saline. Do not be scared of osmotic demyelination syndrome. You should be scared of edema in the brain in such cases. Okay, so if the patient does not have acute or severe symptoms, then you have time to evaluate the patient. So you send a urine osmolarity, and if you find that the urine is also dilute, that means the urine osmolarity is less than 100, that means the patient either has a very low solute intake or has a lot of free water intake in the form of primary polydipsia, which is a psychiatric disorder, and Beer-Portomania and low solute intake. Okay. But if the patient's urine osmolarity is more than 100, then you look at serum sodium concentration. If the serum sodium concentration is less than 30 and you find that the patient's, now you look at the ECF. If the ECF is expanded, if the patient has volume overload and the urine sodium concentration is low, think of heart failure, liver failure, and nephrotic syndrome. Okay. And if the ECF is reduced, considered vomiting, diarrhea, third spacing, and diuretics that the patient might have taken some time ago. Okay, because otherwise, if you're taking diuretics at the same time, it will cause an increase in urine sodium loss. So if you have an increase in sodium urine, you first ask for history of diuretics. You look at the patient's prescription, and you see that the urine sodium is increased, and the patient is taking diuretics. Then it's either diuretics or the kidney disease, because in kidney disease also the patient will be taking diuretics. If there is no history of diuretics or kidney disease, you then look at ECF. If the ECF is normal, the most common condition is SIAD. Okay. And if the ECF is reduced, you have vomiting, salt wasting, which can either be cerebral or renal, and occult diuretics. Okay. This is what you look at. So if you go to the algorithm again, if you have a patient with SIAD, if you have patient with SIAD, you find that the urine osmolarity is more than 100, you calculate the urinary sodium concentration, and you find that urinary sodium is more than 30 millimoles per liter. You don't have a history of diuretics or kidney disease, and the ECF volume is normal. That is how you diagnose SIAD. Because hypothyroidism, secondary adrenal insufficiency, occult diuretics are not common. So practically, for all practical purposes, if you find a normal ECF volume with a high urine sodium without a diuretic use or kidney disease history, it is SIAD. The gold standard to diagnose hypovolemia, as I said before, is infusion. So you infuse 0.9% of NaCl with monitoring of serum sodium. If it is hypovolemic hyponatremia, like for example, dehydration due to diarrhea or vomiting, with 0.9% NaCl, it improves. That is therapeutic also and diagnostic also. Hyponatremia in SIAD may not be corrected and usually worsens. Now, this is the approach that is mentioned in Harrison's based on volume status assessment, which is very important in case of resource limited settings. You can go through this later. We are running short of time. So I'm restarting the management part. Yeah. So we can go slow now. So management depends upon the severity of symptoms, and it does not depend upon how long it took for the symptoms to occur. If the symptoms are severe, it doesn't matter if it was a chronic hyponatremia or an acute hyponatremia, you have to manage it aggressively. As I mentioned, normal saline has 154 milliequivalents of sodium. Ringer lactate has 130 milliequivalents. 3% NaCl, we use 100 ml bottles, but 1 liter of 3% NaCl has 514. So a 100 ml bottle has only 1/10 of that, only 51 milliequivalents of sodium. So in cases of hypovolumic hyponatremia, if the patient has low sodium and is not very severely symptomatic, you don't need to give 3% NaCl, you give normal saline, because that patient needs salt replenishment as much as he needs fluid replenishment. 5% dextrose is a hypotonic fluid, and it does not contribute to osmolarity at all. And DNS is similar to NS with dextrose. So it also has 154 milliequivalents per liter of DNS. Okay. Okay, we can go into calculation of deficit properly now. So total body water is a constant multiplied by body weight, and this constant is different in different categories of patients. Most commonly we use 0.6, which is used for adult male and children. For females we use 0.5, and as the age increases, that constant decreases because the total body water content decreases. Okay, so for example, in this patient, if a patient is 70 kg adult male, the total body water will be 0.6 into 70, which is 42. Okay, and so this is 42 total body water into target concentration by actual concentration. So our target concentration is 140, and if the patient had hyponatremia such that he had 120 milliequivalents of sodium in the calculated serum value, the deficit will be 42 into 20, which is 840 milliequivalents. Now you must remember that you cannot correct this in one day, and you should do it slowly, because there is a risk of osmotic demyelination syndrome. But a simpler formula is, you remember that in chronic hyponatremia, we correct sodium so much that it increases by 6 to 8 milliequivalents every 24 hours. And in cases of acute hyponatremia, remember this is only for moderately severe symptoms. In severe symptoms, you have to correct fast. In moderately severe symptoms, in acute hyponatremia, you can correct by 8 to 10, maximum 12 milliequivalents in 24 hours. And in chronic, you correct by 6 to 8, maximum 10 milliequivalents in 24 hours. So this formula can be very easy as to how much deficit you have to cover in one day. You just make total body water into 10, because that is the deficit, that is your target. So if it is 120, your target concentration for that day is maximum 130, correct? So you multiply TBW into 130 minus 120, because you don't want more than 10 increase every day. To calculate the deficit per day, you can just use the formula total body water into 10 or 8 or 6, depending upon acuteness of the situation. Okay. How much does the sodium increase with the fluid that you are using? So if your infusate sodium is 0.9%, the fluid that you're using is normal saline, what is the infusate sodium in this case? 154. Yes, because I told you normal saline 1 liter has 154, and your serum sodium concentration, for example, in this case is 120 milliequivalent per liter. You divide this by total body water plus 1. So in this case is 43, and this is 34. So 34 by 43 is 0.79. So that means in a 70 kg adult male with sodium of 120, 1 liter of sodium chloride 0.9%. So normal saline increases sodium by 0.79 only. So you imagine how much sodium chloride you will have to give if you have to increase only by 0.79. But these are just calculations and do not apply necessarily in clinical situations. Now, how do you calculate? Actually, this 1000 new formula is derived from this formula. If you go back, I put in 1 hour yesterday and I realized that this formula is derived from this. So what you do is, how do you calculate the rate? Many people ask me, how do you decide how much sodium chloride to give to such a patient with hyponatremia? This is a formula. So 1000 into serum change in sodium per hour. So for example, if you want 1 milliequivalent per hour change for the next few hours, serum change in sodium per hour into total body water plus 1 infused divided by infused sodium minus serum sodium. In this case, what I did was I used the same formula, same values that I put in the previous formula and used in this. So I calculated to increase 0.7 milliequivalent sodium in 1 hour, I would have to infuse 999 ml of NS. That means both these formulas are derived from each other. These are formula that you can use, but generally in the clinical setting, you do not need to use it. You need to assess the volume status. You need to assess the severity of the symptoms and decide on fluids. How much does 3% NaCl increase? The rule of thumb is per kg. So 1 ml per kg of 3% NaCl raises sodium by 1 milliequivalent per liter. So if the patient has 120 milliequivalent of sodium in his body, that is the value, and you give 300 ml of 3% NaCl because it's a 75 kg man and you want to increase by 4, you have to give 300 ml. Okay, and most of the clinicians start 10% NaCl at 10 ml per hour. Even after the end of 24 hours, you would have only given 240 ml. So you would not even increase it by 4 milliequivalents. There might be other factors which cause the serum sodium to increase, but don't believe that your 3% NaCl cause the sodium to jump up. It does not cause any jumping if you give it only 10 milliequivalent per liter. That's a very, very modest approach to do it. You remember the symptoms, moderately severe and severe symptoms? Just to revise, so severe symptoms are vomiting, seizures, low GCS, deep sleep, and cardiorespiratory distress. In case of severe symptoms, you have to treat aggressively. You do not think about if the patient has acute or chronic hyponatremia, and you don't even think about sending samples for osmolarity and waiting for them. You have to treat immediately because the risk of brain edema outweighs the risk of demyelination. So don't think that you will give 3% NaCl very fast, you might kill the patient. No, if you don't treat, the patient might actually die. So 3% saline has to be given, and you can give up to 150 ml over 20 minutes, send the sodium value again, and you can repeat the dose till that sodium value comes and then check sodium again. You can repeat it in the first 1 hour, and our target in the first 1 hour is to increase sodium by 5 milliequivalent per liter. The Indian guidelines say that you can give 100 ml of 3% NaCl over 10 minutes 3 times. So both these guidelines actually give around 300 ml of 3% NaCl, which according to our calculation of a 75 kg man increases the sodium by 4 milliequivalent. So even our calculation matches with the guidelines that to increase around 4 to 5 milliequivalent, which is required in case of very severely symptomatic hyponatremia, you need to give around 300 ml of 3% NaCl. But practically I have not seen any senior clinician giving more than 15 to 20 ml per hour of 3% NaCl. I remember only 1 or 2 clinicians who have had the guts to give 100 to 150 ml of bolus of 3% NaCl. But we need to give it because you will otherwise not cure the brain edema. And in case of acute hyponatremia, there is no role of Vaptens. And as I mentioned in the later slides, Vaptens should not be given with 3% NaCl because then they can really cause a sudden jump in sodium values in the body, and that can really cause osmotic demyelination. So after the first hour, if your sodium rises by 5 milliequivalent, remember this is for severely symptomatic patients, and the symptoms improve, you stop the infusion. You look for the cause now and continue 0.9% at the lowest possible infusion rate, because you've passed that dangerous period of severe symptoms. If the severe symptoms do not improve, you continue the 3% infusion and you target an increase of 1 milliequivalent per liter per hour. Okay, so you've increased by 5 and now you target that it increases by 1 milliequivalent every hour. But that also you have to stop after a point, because if the patient has now reached 130, or from the baseline the sodium has increased by 10, you should stop it, because that is our maximum value. And if the patient's symptoms are now better, you should stop it, like in the first case, and you check sodium every 4 hours till 3% infusion until you continue the 3% infusion. In cases of normal saline, you don't need to check every 4 to 6 hours. If the patient has moderately severe symptoms, you have time to work. So you do a cause specific treatment. You look for the cause. Although, yes, for the little bit of symptomatic improvement, you can give a 150 ml bolus of 3% NaCl once, but it's not necessary. If the patient is absolutely sitting fine, you don't need to do anything. Okay, in acute hyponatremia without severe or moderately severe symptoms, if there is a sudden drop of 10, you can give a bolus of 3% NaCl, because the patient might not have symptoms now, but may develop as the brain edema starts to set in. And you check sodium after 4 hours to see that there is no further drop. This is especially in case of exercise-induced hyponatremia, especially marathon runners. In cases of expanded extracellular fluid, if the patient does not have very severe symptoms, you have a lot of time. The most important thing is fluid restriction. And loop diuretics, as I explained to you, cause more free water loss than sodium loss, can be used and are helpful in cases of renal failure, in cases of heart failure and liver failure. SIAD, which is a normovolumic hyponatremia, you first have to rule out hypothyroidism and adrenal insufficiency, although these are very rare. The most important part of management is restriction of fluid. Because this is a euvolumic hyponatremia, giving a lot of 0.9% NaCl is only going to worsen things. Only if there are severe symptoms, you use 3% NaCl. As mentioned before, 3% NaCl is used for management of severe symptomatic hyponatremia, and that time the cause does not matter at all. But once you have moderate symptoms, you can work out the cause. You don't need to treat it so aggressively. Okay, you can use loop diuretics, demeclocycline and Vaptens, but these are given in Indian guidelines and there are no specific indications for them. The European guidelines say only restriction of fluid. That is the only proven method that improves hyponatremia in SIAD. In adrenal insufficiency, obviously the lack of steroids in the body causes hyponatremia, so you need to replace them. In exercise-induced hyponatremia, there are boluses of 3% NaCl that will help, because it is an acute hyponatremia. The patient might not have symptoms, severe symptoms as such, but if there is a drop of more than 10 milliequivalents in sodium, you should give a bolus. When there is a reduced circulatory volume, for example, in diarrhea or vomiting, dehydration, the patient might have an acute kidney injury, you should give 0.9% saline at 0.5 ml per kg per hour, 0.1 ml per kg per hour. If hemodynamically unstable, the need for rapid infusion overrides the risk of rapid increase in sodium. So if the patient has low BP, for example, 60 systolic BP, and you think if I give a lot of fluid, the patient's sodium will increase, that's okay. The body might not have osmotic demyelination syndrome, but with persistent hypotension, the patient might develop acute kidney injury or acute tubular necrosis that you might not be able to reverse later. So always volume repletion overrides sodium repletion. So if the volume is reduced, you have to pump in 0.9% NaCl and not think about increase in sodium. Vaptens are used only in chronic hyponatremia, not in acute. In adjunct, it can be given in adjunct as an adjunct to NaCl administration, but there is always a risk of overcorrection. So I personally never give Vaptens to admitted patients. When I discharge them, if the hyponatremia is still not corrected, I start on a low dose of Vaptens after waiting for around 15-20 days that the hyponatremia is not corrected. But many clinicians use Vaptens even in severe symptomatic hyponatremia. It is not a good practice. Okay, it can be used in fluid overload states like heart failure and liver disease, and trials do not show any long-term benefits with Vaptens. Please do not give Vaptens with 3% NaCl because it really increases the risk of osmotic demyelination. Okay. Vaptens are also contraindicated when the patient's volume is depleted. So in a patient with dehydration due to diarrhea or vomiting, you should not give Vaptens because they can increase the risk of acute kidney injury in such a patient. Okay, so be very careful with Vaptens. Please do not use them left, right, and center. Also, they can cause orthostatic hypertension and hepatic injury. So patients with liver disease, be very careful. Only as a last resort in fluid overload states due to heart failure and liver failure, you can use them. In chronic hyponatremia, always correct less than 8 to 10 milliequivalents in 24 hours, and in 48 hours, it should be less than 18. In cases of low risk of ODS, I'll tell you the conditions that are not very high risk of ODS. You correct 10 to 12, and if the patient has high risk of ODS, for example, if the patient has very severe hyponatremia, so level and duration, if the patient has very acute, and if the patient has a very severe biochemically severe hyponatremia, the risk of ODS increases. So in such cases, you correct only up to maximum 6 milliequivalents in 24 hours. Osmotic demyelination syndrome is a very rare but a devastating syndrome that can happen with the rapid overcorrection of sodium. Pons is the most susceptible part of the brain, and it causes degenerative loss of oligodendrocytes. It can cause something called a locked-in syndrome where the patient cannot move, cannot say anything, but can move his or her eyes, and that is really devastating for the patient, and mostly it is irreversible. Rarely it can cause things like ataxia, Parkinsonism, and dystonias. Risk factors that increase the risk of osmotic demyelination syndrome. So I was talking about who all are at high risk of osmotic demyelination syndrome are people who are alcoholic, who have malnutrition, those who have severe hypokalemia, and liver transplant patients. So a patient who takes a lot of alcohol comes with hyponatremia. Be careful with correction of sodium. What to do if you overcorrect? Yeah, so sometimes you follow the protocol and still it overcorrects. You can give electrolyte free water. You can give plain dextrose, 5%, 10% dextrose, or plain water for the patient to drink. And sometimes even desmopressin can be used if there is a high risk of osmotic demyelination syndrome. Now I'll just revise the algorithm again. So this is for diagnosis. If the patient has acute hyponatremia or severe symptoms, you directly treat, you don't wait. If the patient has moderately severe symptoms, you can wait. You check for urine osmolarity. If the urine is also dilute, you think of high solvent intake or low solute intake. If the urine is properly concentrated, that means the osmolarity is more than 100, you look at urine sodium concentration. If the urine sodium concentration is less than 30 and the ECF is expanded, you think of heart failure, liver cirrhosis, and nephrotic syndrome. If the ECF is reduced, you think of diarrhea and vomiting. Now you look at sodium concentration. If it's more than 30, ask for history of diuretics, and you look if the patient has kidney disease, history of kidney disease. If yes, these are the two main causes, diuretics and kidney disease. If the patient does not take diuretics and does not have kidney disease, and the urinary sodium concentration is still more than 30, if the ECF is normal, the most common cause is SIAD, and then you must look at causes of SIAD, which can be drugs or lung lesions or CNS lesions. But if the ECF is reduced, think of renal cerebral salt wasting, adrenal insufficiency, and vomiting. These are my references. I'll be sending the presentation, and I hope that after this presentation, if you find a patient with severe, the take home message I think is if you find a patient with severe hyponatremia, please don't shy away from giving 3% NaCl, because the risk of cerebral edema is much more than the risk of osmotic demyelination syndrome. And even cerebral edema can cause long lasting effects on the patient. So if you find a patient who has, for example, sodium of 110 and is seizing, please give at least one bolus of 150 ml of 3% NaCl over 10 to 20 minutes. Thank you.